In the name of God, the compassionate and merciful, hello everyone, and welcome to the new episode of the Fact series in which we discuss international political matters every week. This is Foad Mahdavi, and in this episode, I have the honor of being the host of Caleb Maupin, journalist and political analyst from the US. We are here to discuss Trump's mismanagement in the corona crisis and also about the US healthcare system. Thank you for joining us, dear Caleb Maupin, and good to be with you. For the first slide, I'd like to thank you very much. For the first slide, I'd like to have your rich words about general social status of the US. What is happening in the US right now?
Well, the USA was in no way prepared for the COVID-19 coronavirus crisis, and we had plenty of time to prepare. When it was in China and having the devastating effect it had in China, our scientists were aware of what was happening. The alarm bells were being raised, but no real action was taken. We do now know that a number of our politicians actually sold their stocks and made stock market transactions based on realizing it would be this bad. But yet the country was not prepared. And while our politicians were reassuring us that everything was going to be okay, that we were prepared as a country, they were selling off their stocks and making lots of money. But at the same time, the country was not prepared. And the thing is, unlike most countries in the world, the United States does not really have a healthcare system. We have private health insurers, we have some public hospitals and some private hospitals, but overall, healthcare is not provided to the population. There is not universal health insurance. A very large number of people in the United States, millions of people, do not have any health insurance, so they have to pay out of pocket whenever they go to the doctor. And this has presented huge problems. One thing is that people who came to the U.S., who've been in China, or been in Iran, or been in other countries where this has been widespread, they should have gotten tested immediately upon coming back to the United States. That's the responsible thing to do for public health. But one thing that happened is people would come back to the United States from China or from South Korea or wherever, and they would go and get a test, and then they'd be handed a bill for something like $4,000, which is quite a bit of money. Or in some cases, if they could not afford this bill, they would come back to the U.S. and simply not get a test. And at this point, tests are not available. The governors of many states at this point are demanding that tests be made available by the federal government because the tests are not available. We have a shortage of ventilators in the United States. We need ventilators so the treatment can be carried out. And Donald Trump, it took him a very long time to invoke the Defense Production Act and forced Ford Motor Company and General Electric to start mass producing the ventilators we need. And that all throughout this crisis, we see the needs of profits and the interests of corporations, bankers, and Wall Street monopolists being put ahead of the public and what it needs in a time of crisis. And that's a very, very consistent pattern that we are seeing. We have certain voices in the United States that are even saying that that we should end the social distancing, the quarantine, the staying inside, and that we should have the older folks just die because that will be good for the economy. Glenn Beck, a commentator in the United States, said that older folks may want to die for the sake of the U.S. economy. We heard similar things from the lieutenant governor of Texas, who appeared on Fox News, saying that we should maybe expect older people to just die so that that the U.S. economy can get going again. This is a demented sort of thinking where profits are placed above human need, and that's what's playing out here in the United States amid a society-wide crisis. The USA was attacking China for how it handled and responded to the pandemic, but now we have a situation where there are more people in the United States who have the virus than there were in China, where we have foreign countries like Russia, flying in medical assistance and flying in medical aid, and the USA is becoming dependent on different countries around the world for aid and out of almost desperation. Now, this is a big embarrassment to those who defend the United States and its political and economic system.
Mm-hmm. Despite millions of Americans delaying medical treatments due to the cost, the U.S. still spends the most on healthcare of any developed nations in the world, while covering fewer people and achieving worse overall health outcomes. How do you find this matter?
This points to the irrationality of the U.S. healthcare system. Essentially, U.S. healthcare, we have these entities they call, HMOs, which are private insurers. They're set up by the government, and you can subscribe to their services by paying money. And the idea is that if then you become seriously ill, you need medical treatment, the HMO will cover your treatment. This was set up by Richard Nixon during the 1970s. There was widespread calls for the USA to go towards some kind of national healthcare system or national health insurance during the 1950s, but that was crushed. And then in the 1970s, we had the current health insurance system set up by Richard Nixon that is in place. And the result has been that millions of Americans, just don't purchase the health insurance. Now, Barack Obama came into office, and he created Obamacare. And it's widely called Obamacare, but it was called the Affordable Care Act. And it didn't really change that much. It made it a rule that no insurance company could deny you services because of a pre-existing condition. So if you want to start paying for health insurance, no insurance company can deny you because you have previously been ill in your life. So that was somewhat of a step forward. And the other part of Obamacare, which is ridiculous, is that if you don't purchase health insurance in the United States, you receive a fine in your taxes of $1,000. And you are required to pay a fine if you do not get health insurance. However, millions of Americans still do not have health care, and most affordable health care that would actually cover the services people need would cost more than what that fine is. So overall, we have a private health insurance system. We have private hospitals. We have some public hospitals. But overall, we have a pay-as-you-go healthcare system. And this points to the overall problem, not just in our U.S. economic system, but in our entire philosophy here in the West, is that we very much view the situation and the way human beings interact with each other as being purely individualist. We have many expressions about this in the United States. They say a man's house is his castle. They say your freedom ends where my nose starts. There are many different expressions that have been used to put this into words, but essentially the attitude in the United States is that everyone is an individual. It's very similar to what was said by Margaret Thatcher, the UK Prime Minister, who very famously said there's no such thing as society. There are only individuals. And that's kind of the attitude. In the United States, you're on your own. The government doesn't guarantee you employment. The government doesn't guarantee you health care. The government doesn't guarantee you education. And so when it comes to a situation like COVID-19 coronavirus, you can see that approach is just not going to work. This is a society-wide problem. If one person is infected, they become a threat to all of society. And it can only be tackled in a collective way, with the whole country working together. However, our approach is this radical individualism, this liberalism that says everything is an individual's freedom, an individual's initiative, you're on your own, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. This approach cannot handle a society-wide pandemic where the health of one is the health of all, right? That's the reality. If you live in a society where people are deeply ill and infected, even if you are not, even if you have the access to health care, you're still going to have to deal with the problem of living in a society where people don't have the health care that they need, right? And that same goes for education. You might be able to afford education, but if you live in a society where all the people are wildly ignorant, you're still going to have to live in a society that has a problem. Giving people access to health care, giving people access to education is not simply nice. It's not simply an act of kindness. It's an act of self-interest on the part of a society. If you want to have a healthy society, you need to make sure that everyone has access to health care. If you want to have an educated society, you need to make sure that everyone has access to education. Human beings have always been collective creatures from the time of hunter-gatherer civilization up through the ancient empires of Rome and Greece and Persia, up into the time of feudalism and medieval times to the current system of capitalism. Human beings have always operated collectively and worked in groups. They've identified as nations, as religions, as cultures, as communities, as families. Human beings work in groups. We are a species that works together collectively. And the Western liberal ideology has tried to ignore that and tried to hold up radical individualism as the solution to all problems. And it's not working.
Mm-hmm. Of course, a study conducted by researchers at Harvard Medical School found about 50,000 Americans die every year as a direct result of not having any health insurance coverage. And now 70% of Americans are deeply concerned about being infected by coronavirus. Do you confirm it?
Indeed, this is accurate, and I've heard higher numbers than that. I mean, the U.S. healthcare system is quite an embarrassment. No other country pays as much as we pay for healthcare, yet the result is that we have a lower quality of life. We have a lower life expectancy. We have a lower infant mortality rate than most Western countries. The life expectancy in the United States, the infant mortality rate, these things are a national embarrassment. This is a country of 350 million people, and we don't provide people with the services that are needed. Our government has a different agenda. A lot of times, people around the world have kind of a mistaken idea of the United States. People watch, satellite television, and they think that, every American lives, the life of some reality TV star. They live like the Real Housewives of New Jersey or whatnot. That's simply not the case. The USA is a huge country. If you turn on the television, you're often only seeing either New York City, that's where I'm talking to you from, or you'll see Southern California, where Hollywood is, where movies are produced, and where Silicon Valley and some of the tech giants operate. But the USA is far bigger than just Southern California and New York City. There are millions of people in the United States, hundreds of millions, who have a wide variety of beliefs, a wide variety of customs, a wide variety of different ways of life. I've often told people that the United States is not really a nation. A nation is defined as a people with a common heritage, a common culture, a common language, and the United States has none of that, right? The United States is a country. And within the country, there are many different groups, and many of those groups within this country, whether they be low-income white people, whether they be African Americans, whether they be the Chicano people of the Southwest or Latinos, there are many different ethnicities and communities in the United States, and many of those folks do not live very well and do not live anywhere near what people see on TV and associate with all of the United States. This is a misrepresentation. And I believe the intelligence agencies of the United States have worked very, very hard to cultivate this image of the United States as this beautiful country where everyone is wealthy and everyone has an iPad and an iPhone and parties and drinks alcohol and has a great time all the time and no one is ever sad. And this is propaganda. I mean, and this is very carefully crafted propaganda to present the image of the United States in a certain way. The intelligence agencies have worked hard to handle Hollywood and handle international news networks and handle television programming to try and create this false image of U.S. society, glossing over its great hardships and flaws.
Great. As you know, we are about to have the US presidential election. How much has the corona outbreak affected this election? Do you see this crisis, I mean corona crisis, a threat for Trump for re-electing?
Well, here's the thing. We were having the primary vote to determine who will be the Democratic presidential nominee. And you cannot have a vote where people are asked to leave their homes and go to the polls under conditions like this, where it is dangerous for people to go out. And we had multiple states like Louisiana and Ohio actually cancel their primary vote because they felt it was a public health crisis. It was not safe to have people going to the polls. And the response of the Democratic National Committee to those states that canceled their vote was to threaten to take away their delegates at the National Convention and deprive them of the ability to help pick the nominee. And we had leaders of the Democratic Party urging people to go to the polls and vote, even amid the pandemic. And it showed a pretty outrageous double standard. If another country were to try and have an election under these conditions, the United States would decry it and condemn it. And it appears that Joe Biden has been kind of anointed as the nominee of the Democratic Party, despite the fact that he, at this point, is having difficulty finishing his sentences. He appears to be not well in terms of mental health. He continues to say racially offensive things in speeches. He continues to make comments that are not coherent. And many people are wondering if he is really qualified to be president. And Donald Trump, he is mishandling the crisis. He's being widely criticized for doing so. But if his opponent is someone who is incoherent and is unable to speak clearly and articulate any solid criticism, it's rather unlikely that Donald Trump will be defeated. I predicted that Donald Trump would be reelected unless there were dramatic moves in the United States and unless the U.S. economy really suffered. Right now, this pandemic is very dramatic. More coronavirus cases in the USA than any other country in the world. The stock market is just falling apart. We're looking at $10 a barrel in oil. I mean, this is a huge economic problem. But that said, if the opponent to Trump is not someone who can articulate a clear message, articulate clear criticisms, put forward a more winning vision, Trump may very well be reelected. One thing that concerns me is that within the Trump administration, there seem to be different factions. And Mike Pompeo, the U.S. Secretary of State, is probably the most dangerous person in the United States at this point. He sees this pandemic not as a moment where the global community can come together and talk about tackling it and getting a solution, but as an opportunity. He has ratcheted up sanctions against Iran. He has ratcheted up sanctions and activities against Venezuela. He refused very famously to sign a G20 statement. He insists on calling it not the coronavirus or COVID-19, but the China flu, the China virus. He's trying to stoke anti-Chinese sentiments. Mike Pompeo is deranged. He is acting like a deranged psychopath at this point. He doesn't want to solve the crisis. He wants to use this as an opportunity to escalate international tensions. It's extremely dangerous. And it's clear that not all of the Trump administration agrees with Mike Pompeo. There are differences within the White House. One day Trump will talk one way. The next day he'll talk another way. There's very big confusion. But Mike Pompeo comes out of a particular faction within the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency. He was CIA director at one point. There's a particular faction. The CIA tend to be liberals, from my understanding. They tend to believe in soft power operations as opposed to big wars. They tend to favor social liberalism like gay rights, LGBT issues, feminism and such. But there is a particular faction within the CIA. George Herbert Walker Bush, who was the President Bush, the first President Bush of the United States, he was CIA director for many years. Now Gina Haspel has moved up to be CIA director under Trump. And while it seems that most of the Central Intelligence Agency is very hostile to Trump, and the intelligence agencies have been working to undermine Donald Trump, there is a particular faction within the CIA that Mike Pompeo, Gina Haspel, and the Bush family come out of. And that faction seems to be very committed to regime change operations, very committed to destabilizing countries around the world, and just purely sees this crisis as an opportunity to escalate such efforts.
Mm-hmm. Many commentators see Trump's rise to power in the United States as weakening, ridiculing, and deteriorating U.S. foreign policy. Do you think so?
Well, Trump ran on a platform of saying that he would not intervene around the world, and that the USA would put America first. And he basically presented himself as if he were an isolationist. And people voted for him in big numbers because they were hoping that that would be the result. Many people felt like their communities had been ignored. Many low-income white people in the United States, in states like Indiana and Ohio, where I grew up, and Michigan, Wisconsin, they felt like their needs were being ignored, that the White House and the government in Washington, D.C. was focused on meeting the needs of people in the West Coast and the East Coast and the urban centers, and was ignoring the rural population and low-income workers. In addition, there have been racial difficulties. There was resentment against Obama. People felt like Obama, as the first black president, was concerned about Black Lives Matter and other issues. And there's internal racial strife, and that's been a long-standing issue. There's hostility toward immigrants. A number of low-income white people feel like immigrants are their enemies, or taking their jobs, and blame them for the economic difficulties. And Trump's rise to power, it represented, on the one hand, an increasing level of racism and xenophobia and hostility to non-whites, but it also at the same time represented a feeling that rich corporations had too much power, and that these wars that are being waged around the world are not being waged in the interest of the United States. So it was mixed. It was complicated. Like many things in the United States right now, it had many sides, and it was very complicated. But overall, it shows that there are divisions in the United States, not really among the population, but among the rich and powerful. The rich and powerful people in the United States, the wealthy people, the big corporations and bankers, they have a lot of divisions. They don't see eye to eye. There are different agendas. They want different things. The fracking companies have a rivalry with the big four super major oil companies. The military manufacturers have a rivalry with the intelligence agencies. And that there are deep-seated divisions among the rich and powerful. And in many ways, Trump kind of represented an uprising among the rich against the ultra-rich. The entrenched oil banking families, the Rockefellers, Carnegies, DuPonts, Vanderbilts, they kind of were very in with the Obama administration. They're tied to Wall Street and the four super major oil companies. Whereas the Trump administration represented a lot of wealthy people who feel like they're kind of locked out of the club. They're not allowed to be part of the leadership of the country. They would prefer a more hands-off approach so the market can operate, so the government is less involved. They feel like there should be more of a free market approach, and that the government ruins things. Betsy DeVos, who was Donald Trump's Secretary of Education, she is tied to Amway, which is a corporation in the United States where people sell Tupperware. She's also tied to Blackwater, the military contracting corporation. One of the big supporters of Donald Trump is Bernie Marcus, and he's the owner of a chain of hardware stores in the United States called Home Depot. The Koch brothers, who started out with an oil company and are involved with hydraulic fracking, they're big supporters of Donald Trump at this point. There are many different factions that are supporting Trump. There's Sheldon Adelson, who is a large real estate owner from Nevada and is very closely tied in with the Likud party in Israel. So there's a faction that backs Trump, and there's certain constituencies. A lot of Cuban Americans who fled to get away from Fidel Castro are big supporters of Donald Trump. Supporters of the Shah of Iran, are big supporters of Trump. So there's certain constituencies that he tries to appeal to. But overall, the richest of the rich in the United States, the ultra-rich, you could call them, the big four super major oil companies, the folk connected to Chase Bank and HSBC Bank, British Petroleum, ExxonMobil, they view Trump as a dangerous radical who is stirring up the United States, causing confrontations that are unnecessary. They would prefer stability so that they can maintain their power and gradually move ahead in the interest of their system. Whereas Donald Trump and his forces want to make lots of money, and they resent government control. They want unregulated capitalism. So there are some big divisions.
The US president claims that increasing pressure on Iran will change the behavior of the Islamic Republic. Even in this harsh condition due to the corona outbreak, Trump is continuing his evil goals against Iran. How do you analyze this negative things on behalf of Trump?
The main goal of Donald Trump with Iran is to make sure that no possible détente or agreement or reconciliation with Iran and the United States ever takes place. That is his main goal. That is the reason he killed Qasem Soleimani. That is the reason he ripped up the Iran nuclear deal, is that his supporters in the military manufacturing companies and the military industrial complex have way too much to gain from having Iran as an enemy. They are selling weapons all over the Middle East to countries like Kuwait and Saudi Arabia and Jordan and other U.S.-aligned regimes. If there were to be peace and reconciliation with Iran, they would potentially lose out on their money. They're tied in with the Likud party in Israel, and the way the Likud party has gotten elected is by playing up the idea that Iran is a threat, that Israel is under attack, that Iran is coming to get them, and so it's very, very important to Donald Trump that Iran remains an enemy of the United States, and that that there ends up being hostility and tension in that region, right? That the Obama administration wanted to negotiate with Iran, wanted to lift some sanctions, and gradually move U.S. influence into Iran. That was their goal. Their goal was to kind of conduct soft power and expand U.S. influence within Iran, ease tensions while inserting U.S. voices and give a friendlier face to the United States, very similar to what was done to Libya under Gaddafi, right? The way Gaddafi was overthrown was first the Obama administration was very friendly, restored relations, many U.S. people were moved in, and eventually Libya was destabilized and overthrown. Cuba, it's been revealed that was the plan in reconciliation with Cuba, is that that there was a lifting of sanctions, the USA recognized Cuba, set up an embassy in Cuba, And the idea was that, the USA was going to manipulate social media and eventually destabilize the government and overthrow Fidel Castro. But with Iran, it appears that, the Obama administration's strategy has been completely upended by Trump. And Trump doesn't really want to overthrow the Islamic Republic of Iran. He wants to make a lot of money from escalating confrontation. And that's really all there is to it. And so if any hope for reconciliation with Iran has to be squashed, and he hopes that this can be extended to after he leaves office. His goal is to just make it so there could never be something like the nuclear deal ever again. That is what he wants to do, because the nuclear deal was a threat to the Likud party in Israel and their power in Israel. It's a threat to the military-industrial complex in the United States. And that's why the Atlantic Council, which is, that's a NATO think tank that's very closely tied in with intelligence agencies in the United States, actually denounced the move of killing Qasem Soleimani, because they operated on this, this strategy of utilizing soft power against the Islamic Republic. The goal is the same, right? They have no love for Iran. They want to isolate Iran and weaken Iran. But, the rich and powerful, the let me put it this way, the super rich in the United States and the intelligence agencies have one strategy, whereas the strategy of the military-industrial complex is very different. And so there's a divergence of strategies, and there is some direct economic interest in escalating tension with Iran. Trump has a lot to gain from escalating tension with Iran, and so no reconciliation would be in his interest.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, dear Caleb Maupin, thank you so much for your rich words. Actually, we can talk about some other issues in upcoming interviews if you agree. Of course, yeah, if you think that for this actually subject, if you think that something is missing, I'm all ears.
No, I think we've spoken about it, and I know that Iran is really suffering amid the coronavirus outbreak. And I can assure you that while Mike Pompeo is full of hate and that there's nothing but hatred for Iran, there are many Americans who have nothing but empathy and do care that people in Iran are suffering amid this coronavirus outbreak and are not motivated by malice and hate. And that the voices that represent U.S. society in the international media don't really represent the population overall. Many people in the United States are questioning their government. Many people in the United States are tired of these wars and tired of these international tensions and escalations. So I would remind people that beneath the surface in the United States, there is a very different perspective. Many people in the United States are tired, very, very tired of the way our politicians operate, and are very disgusted to see that in a time when Iran is suffering, China has suffered, Italy is suffering, many countries are suffering, that instead of trying to solve the crisis and have international unity against the crisis, that our leaders are escalating tensions and trying to use it as almost a weapon. That disgusts many people in the United States, and that their sentiments, while they may appear to represent the United States of America, they're far from universal. Many people don't agree with how our leaders are acting amid this crisis.
Thank you so much. Thanks for joining us again, and I do really appreciate you to your noteworthy remarks. I hope things are going well with you and your work, also far away from anything negative. Thank you so much, and bye-bye.
Thank you.
Dear audience, it was another talk with Caleb Maupin, journalist and political analyst from the US. Thank you for watching, and catch you later.